Hello everyone and welcome to week 3 of our course. Okay, let's take a look at what we did last week because it's going to frame what we're going to do this week. So last week we talked about selecting projects and how we go ahead and get them started. We focused on project phases, and then in that discussion we also looked at the process groups, specifically initiating and planning. We looked at those process groups and we looked at two knowledge areas, which was the scope, project scope, and project communications. And the big thing we looked at under scope was building a work breakdown structure. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind because we're going to build on those concepts today or this week. Okay, so this week we're going to work on schedule management. So we looked at the scope. Now we need to say or determine how we're going to actually accomplish the scope, how we're going to get there. Okay, we need to build an initial schedule, but that doesn't just happen. There's a plan for that. So in the PMBOK, you'll notice there's a common methodology for each of the knowledge areas. So for whatever knowledge area it is, we're going to have to actually plan what we're going to do, and then we're going to actually get to it. And that's what you see here with schedule management. So under schedule management, we're going to plan how we're going to go about doing it. Then we're going to define our activities. We're going to put them in the appropriate sequence so that they flow smoothly from start to finish. Then we're going to estimate how long each of those activities is going to take. And then using that information, we can build our initial schedule. And then once our schedule is built, we can control our schedule. So let's take a look at that kind of graphically. So you see, we start with defining activities. So once we define our activities, we come up with an activity list. And an activity list is an input for two different things. One is sequencing our activities so that we can put them in a proper order. And we do that using a project schedule network diagram, and we'll see that later. And then the second part is estimating our activity durations. And the outcome of that is your duration estimates. So you put your project schedule network diagram, which is the sequence that your tasks need to happen. Then you apply your duration estimates, you put those together, and you get your schedule. And then later on, when we're actually accomplishing the project tasks themselves, we're going to take a look at our schedule and we're going to control it. We're going to see how we're doing and make changes as necessary. Okay, so let's start with planning schedule management. Pretty straightforward. We can't just jump right into it. We need to methodically plan what we're going to do, and a lot of that is based on your organization and the way that they want you to do things. But you're going to use your project charter, you're going to use your scope, and you're going to determine how you're going to build your schedule. And once you've got that built, then you can move forward. Then the biggest part of this is defining activities. And we're going to look at what an activity is next, but we have to actually go through a work breakdown structure. We started at the top level, which was our actual project, and then we decomposed it into the major sub-elements of our project. And then we broke it down even farther so that you get down through decomposition to a level of detail that you need to define activities. Okay, so let's take a look at what an activity is. Here are characteristics of an activity. Okay, an activity is where an action is performed. You're going to do something as part of your project. Okay, it could be making something, it could be providing an estimate, it could be anything, but you're going to actually do something. It has a tangible output, and it's also small enough that you can control it, that you can estimate how long it's going to take, and then you can have a status for it. So an activity should be small enough that you can say it's going to take one person 8 hours to do this activity. And that's really what we're looking for so that we can estimate how long it's going to take and then later on how much it's going to cost us. And one thing I want to highlight here is a milestone. So a milestone is an event, but it has a 0 duration. So usually it's a notable event, a deliverable, or a key part in your project, and you want to highlight those as milestones. Okay, so just keep that in mind, but a milestone is a 0 duration event. So once we've defined the activities, we need to sequence them. They just don't randomly get thrown onto a schedule. Some activities need to happen before others can happen. So there's definitely a sequence from start to finish for your activities, and let's talk about that in a little more detail. Okay, so let's talk about our 3 most common activity relationships. So starting on the left, you see the finish to start relationship. This is the most common. So on the left, you have a predecessor task in purple. And on the right, you have a successor task. So what that means is the predecessor task must finish before the successor task can begin. So in this case, you must contact your friends and coordinate with them and get their input before you can have your lunch together. So pretty straightforward. You can't have your lunch together until you've called your friends and figured out when they're available. So predecessor task must complete before a successor task can begin. Pretty straightforward. Now here's two other ones on the right-hand side. And the first one is finish to finish. In this case, you see that activity 1 and activity 2 each started at different times, but they finish at the same time. So activity 1 and activity 2 occur independently, they start independently, but they must finish at the same time. And on the right, you see a start-to-start relationship, where activity 3 and activity 4 must start at the same time, but they have different durations and they'll end independently. Okay, so these are the three different relationships that you'll see. Most common is predecessor to successor, which is finish to start. You also have leads and lags because there is sometimes a period of time between the predecessor and the successor task. So let's take a look at the one on the left. In purple is the predecessor, pour concrete. And in orange is the successor, which is install your framework. Okay, you must let the concrete sit for 3 days before you can start installing your steel frame. You must let the concrete dry. That is a 3-day lag. There's no way around it. So that task is over, pouring concrete is done, but there's a 3-day lag before your successor task can begin. Okay, so that's very important when you're doing things. If there's a lag, you must account for that. And then here's another one with a lead. So in this case, your predecessor task, gathering packing materials, has begun. You don't need to wait to have all of your packing materials on hand before you start separating your small items if you're going to pack for a move. You can start doing that while you're gathering packing materials. So I can start that, a day before my predecessor task is done, and that's a lead. And leads and lags are important when we're actually sequencing our activities. Okay, so how do we define, or how do we display this? A good way to display the relationships is with a precedence diagram. And you see here on the top left the way it will be shown if you had your WBS built in Microsoft Project and you did that for the wedding or reunion WBS. Very similar. You have your key tasks and they're broken down or decomposed into the sub-elements there. And now, so let's start sequencing them. And you can see on the left-hand side it has the actual task ID, and on the right-hand side it has the predecessor. So you can see task 1.2, host planning lunch. Well, 1.1 must happen before that. Okay, so that is a finish to start relationship, and it's shown here graphically with the arrows. 1.1 must finish before 1.2 can begin. 1.2 must finish before 1.3 can begin, and so on. And you can see the relationships built here. So depending on if you're visually oriented, this is very helpful. If you're good with just a breakdown in text format, then maybe you don't need this. But this is, for a more complex project, a very good way to visualize the sequence of the tasks. So now that we've put them in the proper sequence, now we need to estimate how long they're going to take. This is always tricky and difficult, but there's a couple different ways. One is a top-down method, which is analogous estimating, where you can say, well, we did that particular activity before, and when we did it before, it took 8 hours. Since it's very similar, as an analogy, analogous estimate, since it took 8 hours last time we did it, we can estimate that it will take 8 hours this time. That's great if you have data to use of something that's very similar. Parametric is, well, if it takes us 3 hours to do one part of this task, and the task repeats itself over and over again, then we can say we just multiply that out. So if I can do 100 meters of fence, if my crew can install 100 meters of fence in 1 day and I want to install 500 meters of fence, then it's going to take me 5 days, 100 times 5. That's a parametric estimate. When I have an estimate based on data from before of how long it takes to build one part of it, and I need to build a longer structure, then I just multiply it out. Then there's a 3-point estimate, which is more likely what you're going to use. because you don't always have those other estimates to use. And it's basically PERT, which is the Program Evaluation Review Technique. Pretty straightforward. You take an optimistic estimate, you take a realistic estimate, you take a pessimistic estimate, you add them all together and divide by 3. It's kind of just averaging it out. So on the optimistic side, it's going to take 1 day. On the pessimistic side, it's going to take 4 days. Realistically, it's probably going to take 2.5 days. So you add those all together and divide by 3, and you kind of take just the average of them. And that's usually your best guess. Now that we've estimated our durations and we've built our sequence, now we can go ahead and actually put our schedule together. And that's just going to be our initial schedule. We're going to refine it as we go a little bit later, but essentially we've taken those two inputs, we put them together, and we have our initial schedule. So let's talk about a couple things. We talked about leads and lags. Let's talk about float. These are terms that you'll see in the reading there in 8.3 of the ebook. But early start is the earliest date an activity can begin. And then float, sometimes known as slack, is the amount of time that an activity can be delayed from the early start without changing the completion date. So sometimes, you might be able to wait a couple of days to start something without it delaying the project's completion time, and that is float or slack. And late start is the latest possible date an activity can start without impacting the critical path. We're going to talk about the critical path next. So just kind of keep these concepts in mind. The book does a good job of explaining them and has some better examples. But this is the critical path. We used this diagram before. The critical path is highlighted in red. That is the sequence of activities that takes the longest amount of time to occur. That is the longest path through the project, and that is the latest completion date of our project. So you can see the sequence there, 1.1 to 1.2 to 1.3 to 2.2.1 and so on, all the way to the end in red. The longest path will take us 8 days. That is our critical path. There's no float, because remember, float is how much I can, delay the start without affecting the final date of the project. Well, critical path has no float. If I delay any of these, I will delay the finish of my project. The critical path has no float. It's very important to know the critical path because those are the tasks that you don't have the ability to move, to play with, because they have no float. So once we built our schedule, we've identified the critical path. Now we have to control it. And this is a little bit later once we start actually getting into our project. But you'll start doing things like tracking progress, see where we are on the accomplishment of milestones. We'll use phases and so on. There's a whole bunch of things that you could do to control the schedule. We'll talk about those a little bit later, but remember, in the PMBOK methodology, you plan it, you actually do something, and then you control it, and that's exactly what control the schedule is. Okay, so let's take a look at our assignment for week 3. So in week 2, we did a very simple WBS for a wedding, okay, and then we also built the charter. So now for week 3, we're going to get a little more complicated. We're going to take, using the charter, we're going to build, which has the scope, we're going to build a WBS for Mama's Bakery. Okay, so in the charter, you define the scope, kind of what you're going to do for Mama's Bakery, what needs to happen, and generally how long you think it's going to take. We're going to take that and we're going to decompose it into a WBS, which has all the major elements in there. And this is an individual assignment. So you did the scope as a group, you do the WBS individually, and you'll do that in Microsoft Project. So last week you had the wedding reunion, which was very simple WBS. In Microsoft Project, this is a little more complex. So you're going to go ahead and build that, and the details on what you need to do are on pages 28 to 35 of the ITP master document. Please take a look at that. And then finally, talks about the discussions, but the big thing there is if you have questions, please contact me by email or post on the Ask Your Professor. Don't wait to the last minute.